how I felt this call to food security. I started as an undergraduate studying chemistry. I then went to graduate school in food science, got a doctorate in food science with a specialty in packaging. Worked for the food industry for 12 years, started consulting after Abe was born in 1981. Got into international work in 1991. Now this gets a little bit significant because in 1992, I represented the United States at the International Symposium on Packaging, Economic Development, and the Environment. I was an international expert. I had been to 5 countries at that point, and everybody else at this Congress had 35 years of experience in international stuff. So I felt a little bit like a new guy in the woods. It was kind of interesting. But something very interesting happened at that Congress. There was this was in the early 90s when everybody was concerned about packaging and solid waste and that packaging was filling up the landfills. Wasn't true, but that was the perception. And as a result, legislators were starting to come up with laws against packaging. And in Germany and in the United States, all over the world. And so this symposium would get together. We had 12 countries represented. And the developed world, like Germany and Austria and Switzerland and the United States, were saying that we have a problem with this packaging solid waste we have to do something with. And the guy from Vietnam stood up and he says, well, if you don't want that packaging material, please send it to us because we have a problem with food waste. We don't have packaging and a tremendous amount of our food goes bad and we need that packaging material. And that gentleman changed my thinking drastically. That was really the time where I started switching my thinking to the idea that we have a food security problem. We produce enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the earth, but we don't distribute it to them. And that distribution is very closely related to packaging. So I realized that then that I have the chemistry background, which tells me how things degrade, the food science background that tells me how that relates to food and how to slow it down, packaging that takes whatever you do to food and lets it be preserved. If you can food, well, try taking pasteurized milk and not having a container to put it in. It doesn't sort of work. So packaging is actually essential. And then I got involved with international trade. So I realized that I had 4 components that together gave me a somewhat unique perspective on food security and an ability to do something about it. So I realized that this might be a calling. Okay, can you have a calling to an atheist? I'm not sure. Okay, so in 1997, I was invited to apply for an endowed professorship, the first endowed professorship of packaging science in the United States, and I decided that it would be very much worthwhile taking on this assignment if I could set up a Center for Global Food Security. And Clemson agreed to that during the interview and did not quite agree to it after I got on board. So I set up a multidisciplinary group, and the idea for the center, and what I ended up doing with a cooperative group, was to look at food distribution, find out where the food got lost, by insects, by birds, by crushing, by anything you can think of, and develop remedies with the help of people in the microbiology department, packaging science, food science, economics, international trade, all of these different groups. So we ended up with this multidisciplinary group. And then 2 years later, I was going to be speaking at the World Food Congress, and I was invited to chair the session on food security because the gentleman that ran the 9th Food Congress, where they declared that we wanted to cut hunger worldwide, got into a health situation, couldn't leave Thailand, and asked me to take over the chairmanship of the food security. So this is the Congress right after the one that declared this. So this is pretty interesting stuff. And I told my department chair that I was invited to chair this session, and he said if I accepted that invitation, it was a declaration I was leaving the department. And the bottom line was I had a fantastic time in Sydney, Australia. And the next year, I brought the idea of global food security to the Woodstock Institute for Science and Service to Humanity, the board of directors that was meeting in July, and got the emphasis on food security approved as a major project in the food security, in the WISH Institute. And I left Clemson in the following year in 2001 at the end of the semester. I represented the U.S. and food packaging at the World Food Summit 5 years later. That's where the Director General, General Secretary of FAO said that we can't do, that was the first time he said we can't do what we're doing with business as usual. We have to have a different approach. So they had the world community, 185 countries, get back together in Rome for this World Food Summit 5 years later. And I made emphasize post-harvest because most of the discussion was on agricultural production. And I made a presentation to FAO during that summit, and there were something like 5 people in FAO that were doing post-harvest out of 5,000 employees. And post-harvest was not really in the thinking of FAO at that time. Almost all of the effort and all of the international cooperation was based on agricultural production. In 2003, I was a speaker at the World Food Congress 12, and at that Congress I met with delegates, and they sort of convinced me that if you're going to try and work on food security in the developing world, where possible, do it through the women leaders. Because women will feed the family, whereas men will feed themselves first and then the family. So if you want to be effective, go to the women leaders. And the gentleman who showed me this was from Thailand, and actually the guy who drove, the guy who did the World Food Congress 9 to the hospital. He showed pictures, and he said that there is a woman leader in most of these situations, whether or not she's the designated leader. So there was this guy up in front talking, and the eyes of the people were looking at this woman. He says, that's how you find the woman leader. Okay? So whether it's official or not, she's usually there. In 2004, I was invited to do a short course on post-harvest technology in Sri Lanka. And after the course, somebody asked me if I'd like to come to visit their Institute of Post-Harvest Technology. And when I picked myself off of the floor after being 30 years in the industry, I said, what Institute of Post-Harvest Technology? And basically, they have recognized that post-harvest losses are unacceptable, and the government has an Institute of Post-Harvest Technology where they're doing exactly what I proposed at Clemson quite a few years earlier. Okay? I thought that was kind of amazing. Next year, I was invited to give a couple talks in Thailand. I gave one on packaging to protect, preserve, and add value to food, and another one on feeding the world within our grasp. And they invited me to their Post-Harvest Institute of Technology. And they're doing fantastic work. Okay? And they told me about this harvester that can reduce food losses when you're harvesting rice from 20% to 2%. And he proudly shows me this article in Thai. The pictures were nice. But what I came to realize, Sri Lanka published their stuff in Sinhalese, and nobody outside Sri Lanka can read it. The guys in Thailand were publishing it in Thai, nobody can read it. And since then, I found institutes in China, Indonesia, Myanmar, believe it or not, a couple of them in India, Philippines. They're all over the world, and by and large, they publish in their local language, they work locally, the government does not have support for them going to international congresses. And basically, nobody except the people in their countries know that they're doing this fantastic work. So I came up with the idea that it's within our grasp, instead of us doing work to find out what you can do to reduce food losses, why don't we take what already is out there, where they know how to reduce food losses, take the food that is currently produced and not given to people, and get international cooperation of these organizations. And that sounds like a simple concept. It has a little bit of difficulties because people don't always talk with each other in different countries. They don't have a budget for doing so. And the technology that's available in one country that works on one type of tuber may or may not be obvious it'll work in another country, another type of tuber. So the idea was to get a series of food and packaging scientists that would help with this technology transfer effort and actually help affect that transfer, identify what can work and what won't. And at the World Food Congresses, I started talking to people about this, and I got a lot of professionals that were willing to volunteer their time to help with technology transfer. And since I do have time, I'm going to give it just a couple of examples. the idea was that these professionals would agree for free to transfer technology that they already knew, okay, by email, by letter, by telephone call, or by personal, whatever. So, an example, I got a call from a gentleman in Ghana, and he says, how do you guys preserve bananas? Okay, bananas in the green state will last for months. Once they turn yellow, they'll last for days. And if you notice when you go to the supermarket, all of the bananas seem to be at the same level of ripening. Isn't that amazing? Okay, the way it happens is that when you're storing them in the green state, there is a hormone that triggers the ripening process. And if you scrub that hormone, they stay in the green state for a long time. And then you put them in the coolers at the supermarket distribution center. And then when you want to take them out, you gas them with ethylene, which triggers the ripening process. You send them to the supermarket. They all ripen at the same level. Okay? So the trick is, that's what you do. So I told this guy in Ghana, he says, that's what you do. You scrub the ethylene, you gas them with ethylene, and then that's it. And he said, great. What do you scrub them with, and how much do you gas them with, and what do you use to do that? So I called up a plant physiologist over at Rutgers University. He says, oh, it's simple. You scrub it with potassium permanganate, and you gas it with 1 part per million, and this is the equipment you do it with. That's what I'm talking about. If they know the answer, they will give it freely. Now, nobody is going to volunteer on a protracted basis if they don't have some benefit. So if the technology sort of exists but needs a little tweaking, that's a consulting fee, paid for by the country that needs the work. Sometimes you get a problem that doesn't have a solution. Well, that requires new development. So the idea is that the country that needs this technology will sponsor one of their best students to come to a land-grant university or the equivalent in other countries, pay for the student to get the, as a research project, figure out the solution to that problem. And if they return to the country, it was a grant, and if they don't, it was a loan. So by this system, you have a situation where there's an incentive system, so you either get something for your money or it doesn't cost you anything. So we put this program together, and I have no idea where I left off in my notes, but we started realizing that if you can start cutting the food losses internationally, if you could cut 1/10 of 1% of the losses, you could feed about 30 million people for a year. 1/10 of 1% is possible. It's not only possible, it's probably easily doable if you get the international cooperation. So I started seeking support from governments and foundations to try and get this program going. I've done a lot of work in individual countries, but the international program requires learn about what different countries are doing, catalog it, figure out where you can get some transfers and start getting it going. And I'm a slow learner. After 13 years of doing this, I realized, when I couldn't get any money from either government or foundations, I realized that all foundations and government agencies get more requests than they can possibly handle. So what they do is they set guidelines, and if you don't meet the guidelines, you get this automatic letter that says, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but we don't fund that. And they say it nicer than that, but that's basically what happened. And so I thought that this wonderful proposal would go in, somebody would read it and say, oh, we will fund this anyway. It doesn't happen. There's a secretary in the front office, and she gives the automatic letters. It never gets into the organization. So I figured out that there's no way I'm going to get this thing funded unless I go to either individuals or private businesses. And I haven't gotten individuals, but Jan opened up the door about fundraising, so if anybody wants to help the effort, I'm perfectly willing to. But that's the basic idea. And I'm starting to, last November, for the first time, I went into the booths at a trade show, and I figured I had nothing to lose. I've been doing this for a long time, and I told Jan that I would sort of slow down if I don't get support for this thing and maybe just write books. And so I go into these booths and say, I want to speak to the president. Okay? And when I was going to speak to the president, I'd say, I want money. And I figured I'd be thrown out on most booths, and but it was worth trying. And turns out that I ended up having these wonderful conversations with the people. They didn't throw me out. The guys who were referring me to the president didn't throw me out because they didn't know who I was, so they didn't know whether it was worthwhile doing so. And when I got to the presidents, I was amazed that they were willing to help to some degree. And I've gotten some donations. One guy gave me a round-trip ticket on Delta Airlines to wherever I want to go. So I've got some support. I've got enough support to do individual countries, but not the big program. So I'm still working on that. So after getting shot down for 13 years, I continue anyway. Does that make it a calling? Or does that just mean I'm dumb? Something along those lines. Continue the effort anyway. And in 2006, there was the World Food Congress 13. And now this is kind of interesting. I was the only person from the United States that was invited to participate in the Symposium on Global Responsibility. The talk was on global food distribution. And I thought that was really amazing that, there are a lot of fantastic people in this country. Why is it one person that gets invited? And then recall what I said about the Right to Food Declaration. There are some negatives about the United States, a little bit of closed-mindedness in a number of respects. A couple of years later, there is a group that was formed called the Global Harmonization Initiative. Now, there is a tremendous amount of food that is wasted because of regulations. Now, I don't know if you know this. There is one county in South Carolina, Gaffney County, that produces more peaches than the entire peach state of Georgia. Interesting? They throw out peaches by the truckload because there is a regulation in the United States that you cannot ship peaches in interstate trade unless they are of at least a certain size. So what the peach growers do is they take the peaches, they harvest them, they clean them, they get them on this bed, and they take out the small ones, put them into a truck, drop them into a landfill. Okay? There was a regulation in Europe that curved cucumbers could not be sold because people didn't like them. They got rid of that regulation. They recognized it was stupid. But the industry now has a de facto standard where they will not accept curved cucumbers. So they get plowed back into the field. There are tremendous amounts of waste that are based on color, size, shape, nothing to do with safety. And the Global Harmonization Initiative is working worldwide to start getting regulations for food strictly on the basis of safety, risk-benefit, and get rid of these regulations that cost us millions of tons of food for no safety reason. So, fantastic group. And I got involved with that one, too. As a matter of fact, I'll give a quick story with that. I went to a couple of meetings with the Global Harmonization Initiative, and then I was copied on an email that says, get in touch with our honorary global ambassador's coordinator, Ken Marsh. And I called up the president of the organization, and I said, did you forget to tell me something? But it's a worthwhile organization, and it's doing good things. In 2009, the FAO announced the passing the $1 billion, which I mentioned. And the World Food Congress 15 was in 2010, and I prepared the talk, Food Security, a Function of Food Production, Delivery, and Regulations. Now, that was last year. 2011, which I think is this year, there was a Save Food Congress associated with the Interpack show in Germany that was talking, it was co-organized by the Interpack show and the FAO. Now, the FAO was the group that in 2002, when I made that presentation to them, they really didn't have a lot of effort going into post-harvest. Well, they co-sponsored this program on post-harvest and had two very significant reports done for the Congress and presented them at the Congress. So this is a complete turnaround and a recognition that this is an extremely important area. So just to give you a perspective of how important this really is to do this and associate with the Interpack. The Interpack is the largest packaging show in the world, which doesn't mean too much, but this year they had 166,000 visitors. They filled 19 pavilions completely, and they had representatives from something like 100 countries. So this is a big show. So them putting this Congress and advertising it all over the show is a very significant change. So there is a fundamental change in the way the world is looking at things now, and I hope it translates to actual action, which it hasn't quite done yet. But they presented something that I think is extremely interesting, that food losses have been quoted at between 30 and 60% worldwide. There was a study that was done in 1974 that was the best study that I had seen up until that time, or since that time. And it basically said that the food losses are so complex. You have insects, you have birds, you have crushing, you have bruising, you have theft, but theft is really not a food loss, it's a food diversion, because if somebody steals the food, they're going to sell it elsewhere. You get stuff lost in the field, you get stuff that starts molding, tons of losses, literally. But what they reported in this study was that the total losses were estimated to be 30% worldwide, or 1.3 billion tons of food per year, okay, wasted or lost. But the thing that was kind of surprising was that the food losses in the developing world, this really isn't surprising, are at the front end of the food chain. The harvesting, the distribution, the warehousing, they don't have the technology or the finances or the infrastructure to deliver things. In the developed world, it's at the far end of the distribution chain. In fact, it's mostly post-consumer wastes, restaurant waste, and us guys throwing things out at home in restaurants. Or supermarkets throwing things out because it's past its expiration date, or they had a curved cucumber that they couldn't sell, or they had an orange tomato that they couldn't sell. So the wastes in the developed world are tremendous. Now here's what's a little bit surprising. The total food waste in the developed world are much higher than those in the developing world. I had the numbers, but it was 95 to 115 kilograms in the developed world and something like, 30 or 40, something like that in the developing world. So there's a tremendous amount of waste that we have. And one of the challenges the Minister of Environment and Agriculture, Minister of Environment and Consumer Programs for Germany got up and said, this food loss is incredible, what can we do? And that's a challenge that I'm trying to do. So I went up to her afterwards, and she's a big politician, and I'm just a guy in the audience. So she said, well, go and speak to my aides. And I decided that I don't need to speak to the aides. I'll write an article and send her a reprint. So I wrote the article. It'll be published this month. July. Okay, so I continue this stuff, and is this a calling? I'm not sure whether it's a calling. Whatever, it became a passion, not like Mel Gibson's passion, but it became a passion. And I've got this unshakable conviction that I have a set of skills that I can do to make a real impact. And whenever I get discouraged and want to step back from it, I realize that I can make more of an impact. It's not me, it's a bunch of people that I might be able to help. So this might be a calling. If I get discouraged, I continue anyway. And I had a quote that I wrote down in my notes. It said, have the skills to make an impact in this particular area, and not doing so would be, in the words of Steve Martin, wonderful to quote, a dirty, rotten shame. So as I said, you can decide whether it's a calling, and we can have some discussion to find out whether it might be. So let's open it up for discussion.